Hey, it's Matthew again. Carer activists raise awareness of unpaid carers, especially those who are caring for someone with mental ill health or caring for someone with cancer. And at times I will cross over to other support needs depending on ill health. But the main thing is families and carers. That's the thing I tend to focus on. Sticking with mental health carers, um, I'm following up the previous video I did earlier regarding the benefits of, well, nearest relatives. I put carers. I shouldn't have put that. It should have been nearest relative versus nominated person because carers is I suppose, is a blanket sort of term. Even a nominated person, I would think, can end up being a carer. And today, or looking into why that might be the case, to be honest. Yes, as a reminder, we have in the works new mental health bill, still up for some debate. In some sense, they're just going to go through what's been suggested, and there may be some amendments as of the year 2024. There's been many recommendations to the bill. I'm not sure how many's been passed, though. Obviously, I can see it's a long-term thing. Things have to be thought through. So, and there's a lot at stake because at the end of the day, it's the lives and quality of life for those affected with mental ill health. And, to be fair, also the ones trying to support them, whether it be the nearest relative or the nominated persons. And you probably see why things are sort of delayed when I'm trying to explain things that I've noticed uh, through this lecture. So as a quick reminder, anyway, I mean, I've sort of rushed off a bit, but the mental health bill basically is outdated. The last act is in 1983. It's now 2024. A couple of years before, it was put forward to revamp that and make it be more modernized. The problem with that act was there was too many instances of patients, people going through mental health system, being detained in the wrong, in police cells and being over medicated, and the rights just weren't treated fairly. Wasn't, as mentioned here, humanely and addressing disparities. And again, that is another lecture, to be honest. So obviously, as I mentioned earlier, reforms were put through. Looking at the treatment plans, end of use of police and prison cells to place people experiencing mental health crisis, and to end the inappropriate detention of autistic people with learning disabilities. There's been lots of instances regarding these things. Overall, though, it should lead to a greater involvement of patients, families, and carers in improving treatment, while also trying to, well, protecting patients, staff, and the wider public. And to be honest, this is not an easy task. It's a complicated um, challenge to focus on, and I don't think a bill alone will solve it. So I guess I couldn't wait to get that one in, really. I should have waited till the end of the lecture, but it's just to point out that these issues are really complex, and I don't think there's one sure, quick way to easily reduce these things that I've mentioned. So I've labeled this one more correctly. This nearest relative versus nominated person. This is the sort of thing, and people might be asking, well, why are you mentioning this thing? There's many other recommendations. Well, for a start, I do raise awareness of unpaid carers. I run groups regarding carers, and this is some of the things that they talk about. The situation is, how will this bill affect their caring role, and why was it introduced? And I'll go through some. I mean, if you've seen my previous video, or if you've not seen it, do go through that, because I've pointed out the benefits regarding if you're the nearest relative in regards to caring for someone with mental ill health. In the past, you would be the first point of call, to be honest. Not always. There will be situations where someone else in the family has been more involved, but the law states it's usually the nearest relative. And there's been a change. Well, there's going to be a change anyway. But then to give patients that more of a choice, and when I say patients, I'm talking about those suffering mental ill health, they can now nominate someone. It doesn't have to be the nearest relative by law. And that, in a sense, does give patients that choice. And there's many good reasons for that. I personally feel there should be more people involved. If you don't want your nearest relative or care involved or whatever, there should be others that you want to be involved. So, yeah, as usual, I did write this down, but I always forget to point it out. So the roles of the nearest relative and nominated person under the Mental Health Act serve as important functions in supporting individuals with mental health conditions. Each role has distinct benefits, enhancing the rights and care of those affected by mental health issues. But I'm not going to go through the benefits this time. I'm going to go through the challenges. So I've got to change this bit of my previous video or the previous lecture. Well, yeah, put it there. What are the challenges? And we'll go through them right now. So, not the benefits this time, excuse that. This is going to be now looking at the challenges. The first one really is conflict of interest. The next relative may have conflicting interests, to be honest, particularly if they have their own views about the individual's treatment that differ from the individual's preferences. I think this is most possibly the number one reason why being the nearest relative to someone going through mental health can be a challenge in that focus if they're not always going to be in the interest of the cared for. It could be abuse. It could be they don't care anyway. They don't have the time. It could be they've caused severe depression, anxiety in the patient. Because of course they're not saying all carers are angels. They're clear, they're not. You will have some that will have conflicts of interest, and there are safeguarding laws, but this strengthens the choice the patient has. They don't have to rely on the nearest relative if they don't want to. The impact of this, though, with this challenge, is it can lead to tension and disputes between the nearest relative and the individual, complicating care decisions because what might happen is that the mental health professionals will still want to work with the nearest relative anyway because it's the law. So unless it's having a serious issue, a really serious thing that is pointed out, which they can, then the conflict of interest might raise its head and still continue. There's also a lack of understanding. There's relative, they might not fully understand the complexities of mental health, I would say, the mental health issues or the treatment process. Now, I agree with this to a point, though. I wouldn't, by choice, I wouldn't want to be the person going through mental illness, to be fair. Although we all have mental health, that doesn't excuse that fact. What's complex, though, is mental ill health can be difficult depending on the illness to understand. You have to, I would say almost go through it. And even if you're going through it, can you find a way of healing? Do you see what I mean? So I'm going to take this one step further. Even though the patient is going through that, then this is where they're most vulnerable and they need that support. But why should it come from someone that doesn't quite understand it? But I still think even if they don't understand it, that's still going to be an issue anyway. That's more likely to be with the professionals, to be honest. but that is how it is. Hands up, families and carers don't understand it, and I've not come across any family and carers saying that they do. They try because they want to see the person get better and they want to know how to care and support for them. So the lack of knowledge can actually hinder, effective advocacy. How can you advocate for something you don't quite understand? And it can hinder the support for that person, which can lead to poor treatment outcomes if the nearest relative or the most likely don't understand. However, and there's a big challenge on this one is that over time, nearest relatives, if they are heavily involved, will pick up on certain things, obviously from a carer's perspective. So I wouldn't say this one. Just want to stand up for those who are eventually, thrown into this situation. They're new to it, and of course, they're not going to understand it. But then over time, there'll be things that they'll pick up on far more, almost far more than, well, I'd say far more than the professionals. Some professionals, to be honest, because they live with them. They might live with them. They might spend a lot of time with them. They'll know the triggers. So yeah, this is a challenge, definitely. But I don't think it's a blanket thing. I don't think it'd be fair to say because you're not been through it, you don't understand it. And I think, yep, that's true to a point, but not always, because there'll always be someone outside that role watching out, for things in that situation. And even if you're nominated, that would still apply. You know, will they have that knowledge? In fact, I'm coming to them in a bit as well. So another problem, well, I'd say challenge really, is the being designated as the nearest relative can sometimes occur without that person's consent or preference. So that it's thrown at the nearest relative, and this can create resentment and discomfort for both the nearest relative and the patient, because the law says, well, there it is, and that's how it is, and too bad, like a lump here. And if there's resentment, then how can the outcome be positive? The patient don't want to involve the nearest relative. Nearest relative feels it's a burden, and they just don't want to be involved. This can happen. I mean, most of the time, people are scrambling to support each other. I think, but yes, this does happen. This is interesting when looking around for this one. While the nearest relative has certain legal rights, there's still limited power in situations where the individual refuses treatment or where professionals do not fully engage with the carer's concern or the nearest relative's concerns. And this eventually leads to helplessness, basically, or being frustrated, and being the nearest relative to someone who's gone through mental ill health or going through it. They just don't have the power. And has always been raised, I suppose, even after this bill would be passed. If they don't have the power, they're questioning, well, why are they trying to fight so hard? And exclusion, and this is chaos all round, to be honest. And yep, it still happens. And I think it'll still happen. I think this is not just a challenge now. I think it'd be a bigger challenge after, to be honest. Mental professionals may prioritize the patient's autonomy over family involvement, leading to situations where the nearest relative is not adequately consulted. And yes, this is a problem. And this exclusion can undermine the support role of the nearest relative, which creates a sense of alienation. They're isolated. It's almost linked to limited power as well. And it's made worse, I suppose, if the patient just doesn't want the nearest relative involved, and they might not choose anyone else either, which makes it even more isolating and challenging. Last one, but not least, there are many more, but this one I've mentioned that from my previous lecture, the complexities of family structures or histories may complicate the designation of nearest relative. And again, this can cause disputes between family members. A good example is the nearest relative just doesn't give a, I'm not going to swear, they don't care. So another relative will step in and fight hard, to support someone. But then they're limited because the law is saying, well, no, it should be the nearest relative. This isn't always the case, though, really isn't. I've seen situations where mental health organizations and professionals will use common sense and involve the one that has the best interest and has the better um, outcome. It's common sense. All right, the law says different, but there has been instances, I'm sure, where the nearest relatives could override certain things not in the best interest of the patient or other family members. So yes, it can lead to really disputes between it can break up whole families, and it's unfortunate. That's how devastating mental ill health can be. So let's look at the challenges. I've quickly typed that in. Challenges regarding nominated persons, because I personally think yes, it's a great option. And one of the big reasons is that, all right, yep, the patient doesn't have to choose the nearest relative, but they've got to choose someone. Um, and I've always sort of said this: the more people that are involved in supporting someone going through mental health, the better the outcome. And one of the reasons is that there's still a focus on that care plan. I think it you know those going through mental illness, mental ill health are very vulnerable. It depends on the illness, obviously. So to put all that pressure on them, and don't get me wrong, they're really strong survivors, and there will, plenty out there that will adequately take control and charge, and they should do, given the freedom, to make decisions for themselves. But there are times when it's just too much, and they're too unwell. And the big one is that the resources aren't there. So it helps to have a nominated person, but there are issues which let's have a look at them. What I've noticed. Right, the role of a nominated persons isn't that clearly defined in mental health services. It's new. So I'm not saying it's completely untested, because the thing is, there's been situations where patients have chosen someone else, above the nearest relative, and it's been fine, no problem. And if that's the case, want to introduce it into law, But then as it stands, it's a big sort of change, because you're now introducing this idea to others that might, if you're nominated and you're not expected to be, or you're not sure about it, what's your role? And the problem with this is, at least, the inconsistencies in how they're recognized and engaged. You see the big issue, and I thought about this. These nominated people are going to become carers, really, than just nominated persons, without a doubt. So it means the mental health services will have extra persons to engage with as carers, let alone the nearest relative. And to complicate matters, the nearest relative, and this is in a situation that they still want to support, will still be carers as well. So you've got an extra characteristic to engage with as carers, depending on who does what. And you also got to remember that one of the roles of nominated persons is to be that bridge to the patient and the nearest relative as well. If they take on that role, so it's a heavy role. It's not something I see people rushing to. They've got to, I would think, have a close idea of that person, It can't be Bill down the pub or someone that met on the inpatient ward. Common sense before rules is what I would suggest. So it's got to be heavily scrutinized. Or what you're going to have is serious instances, to be honest, and it's not again in the patient's interest. So it's case by case, I would think. Um, so yeah, I've gone a bit. Basically, I'm gonna go back actually because I've actually forgotten to mention it. Misunderstandings basically this leads to, and the problem is authority and responsibilities. Each mental health trust across the country or provider may have different focuses because it's new. They're gonna have to relook at certain cases, and they won't all sort of go straight away. Nominated person, so that's it. Be done with it. There should definitely be close scrutiny. But the problem is at the moment it's not that defined. Now, the next one is they don't have legal powers really as it stands. Um, and I mentioned this in my other previous lecture. The nearest relative does have powers really, and a nominated person doesn't. So when those relatives gets annoyed, they can, with this decision, they can pass certain things through, and they can literally hinder um, the ability for the nominated persons to advocate for the person going through the mental health services, and they can easily contact a family solicitor, a mental health solicitor, and say, look, I don't like this decision, and I certainly don't like and there might be a case where it's rightly so. But the problem is what happens when it's an emergency situation. So they don't, if you're gonna be the nominated person, that's something you've got to have some really thinking, very careful about. You don't have that kind of legal standing. Um, there will be challenge, and I've mentioned this, quite a few times already. Patients may struggle to identify a suitable non-nominated person, particularly if they have limited support, social support, or strained family relations. The lack of Obviously the lack of selection can lead to feelings of isolation again for the patient. And the big problem is, as it stands, resources in the mental health system aren't that great to begin with. So it's more pressure on the patient, to be honest, to say, all right, nominate someone, and they're still too unwell, they're not sure to nominate. And even if they do, um, is that person suitable? Will they act as the bridge? Will they close things off? Will they cause conflict? And no doubt, I think it will do. Um, Not all the time. If things go well, then that is fine. Inconsistent support. So the effectiveness of nominated persons depends heavily on the individual's relationship with the patient. And remember what I've said before in the previous slide, the understanding of mental health issues is not going to be that much different. It's just a criticism of the nearest relative. They might not understand it. So who's to say that the nominated person is also going to understand that? So the support will be inconsistent. And I'll always go back to, like, if you've been caring for someone for a length of time, you're more likely going to be understanding that person's needs. Not always, obviously, but we can't say that they don't understand anything. There will be a situation where they'll pick up on things far quicker than someone who's not really been in the role of support. Um, but at the end of the day, it's the choice of the patient. But it must be closely examined. Because again, if the situation where they're newly nominated and they don't understand and they don't look out for the triggers, then it's going to be inconsistent support, and that would mean that the patient's not fully supported, and the role may not fulfill the patient's needs, whether they nominated them. You see what I mean? This is the biggest one, really. Potential for conflict. Now, if the nominated person's views conflict with the medical team's recommendation or the wishes of the patients, it will definitely lead to conflict and lead to tension. This is a serious one. This conflict can actually complicate care and lead to further distress of that patient. So a case-by-case method is not a blanket nominated person and that's it. And if this thing's sort of new, I suspect this stuff will happen. So it's got to be closely scrutinized. And I've not even begun to mention the family structure on this one. Limited awareness. So many patients and families may be unaware of the option of, option to nominate someone, leading to missed opportunities for support. So due to pressures on the mental health system and the number of cases, the option might not always be there. And who's gonna be monitoring this? I mean, all right, CQC, I'm sure. Maybe Health Watch, patient advocates, patients' opinions. So and even if how much powers would they have? It's a massive addition. So there's a lot of strain on the services as it is, and corners will be cut because what will happen is that services will quickly think, okay, who's making the most noise? Who's, defined as the nearest relative? Go with them. We can't really be stressing too much about the family structure. We've got too much on our hands, and therefore there will be missed opportunities for support. And this is going back to, do people know their rights within the mental health system? Do they know the carer's right? That sort of thing. Most people struggle, to be honest. So they really are dependent on what's being told to them. Let's continue. So the common issues for both really is I think there'll always be communication barriers, between professionals, nearest relative, nominated persons. It's basically, there needs to be effective collaboration and advocacy needs to be there, otherwise it'll be compromised. There'll always be a form of misunderstandings and mistrust. That's the situation of communication, really. And what we don't want is it to be negatively affecting the care provided to someone going through the mental health system. There'll be outstanding impacts of services. There will be someone that's clued up and knows how to deal with this. But I think there will be communication barriers as well. This is still, there've been hints of these things being, done before. As I mentioned, patients might in the past have chosen someone else, and the nearest relative might be fine with it. But as it stands, the inadequate training for professionals, mental health professionals, might not receive sufficient training on the roles and rights of nearest relatives, nominated persons. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing this sort of lecture, even though it's heavily aimed at carers. And to be honest, family structures are something else. They really are complex. So a blanket decision, I just don't think will work without sufficient training. And we've got to remember it's resource intensive. So you need to include the family therapists. You'll need to train them on these types of things. Would they have the time? Your care leads will probably be scratching their heads. There's more to support. The nominated persons now automatically become carers. And there'll still be situations where the nearest relative will still need support as well, and then there'll be the confidentiality issues. And it's not always going to be the patient that will have the last say. I promise you, not all will have that last say, even if the law states it. And it's because of it's a split second decision. there might not there be situations when this person will not be adequate because of some of the things I've mentioned before. Or obviously nearest relatives might not be adequate and they might just give up and walk off. So it's a tricky one, and that all this requires some training and education. Uh, there will also be structural challenges with them. As I've always said, this mental system is complex to navigate anyway, and let alone the bar's being raised higher, I'm sure, in order to get into the mental health system. It says it there, what I've mentioned, high caseloads, inadequate resources. If there were resources before, would we have all these instances where the Mental Health Act would need to be revamped? And I'm sure it would have needed to be anyway. But the biggest problem, the elephant in the room, is that the problem's really resources. It really is more funding. Um, that's your that's will solve lots of things. Obviously, you should be scrutinizing where that funding's going. But if that money was there, would all these challenges be apparent? Um, So yeah, the high caseloads because not enough staff, the inadequate resources can limit the involvement of both nearest relatives and nominated persons. Both are carers. There's no escaping it. And both, will be also looking for support, I would think. So it's a strange situation in a sense, but it's also this is the elephant in the room. The systematic issues can lead to insufficient support for both patients and their advocates because nearest relatives and nominated persons will be advocates. So let's sort of wrap this up because I don't want to tend to waffle on a bit. Both, and I put in bold, both the nearest relative and nominated persons play vital roles in supporting people with mental health conditions. However, the challenges associated with each role can hinder the effectiveness and the impact of the overall quality of care. And there are challenges. If someone says, "Oh no, this is the best thing since sliced bread," I'd tell them to think again because yes, it does give more options. It really does, and that should be in the Mental Health Act. I agree, but to say that it isn't, there's not going to be a challenge without, and that I've not mentioned all of them. There will be other things that will pop up. There will be challenges, there benefits, but there are risks. I should have put it risks rather than challenges to be fair. So the bill will be passed at some point, and I wouldn't want to be the person going through it, scrutinizing it. Addressing these issues requires ongoing training, and I did mention training before. Clearer guidelines. The guidelines as it stands are not that clear, to be honest. It's not a blanket. You must do. It should never be that way. It's got to be case by case, closely scrutinized. Improved communication amongst mental health professionals, because there's a lack of them anyway. But that's going to be something that'll need to happen. Patients and their support network. So there's also as I mentioned in my other lecture, remember the nominated persons, one of the roles they plays, they've got somehow to be that bridge to advocate on the patients and to the family structure. And to be honest, that's not an easy role. I don't see a rush of nominated persons. Or I could be wrong. Maybe there will be a rush of them. I'm not a patient, so I don't really know. But as it stands, and I can confidently say on this one, without the resources, it's not going to be an easy role to play, and that's why I'm thinking there's not going to be many people rushing to do that role. And they might say, no, 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 you go with the family structure, you go with that carer. So it's a tricky one. But could be wrong. It just could all work out. By recognizing, and this is to the professionals to be honest, by recognizing and mitigating these challenges, mental health system can support both individuals and the advocates. And notice it doesn't say, well, it doesn't say one or the other. It's this, I'm trying to say both because There'll be situations where the nearest relative is involved. Yep, there might be breakdowns in the communication, and the patient said, "No way, I don't want them involved." But that can change, and sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on the complex family structure. I I still think, and I will repeat this again and again, it shouldn't be a blanket um, push their nearest relative out, which I wouldn't want to see. It should be heard if the patient wants them to be involved, or if there's, they're not sure. It should be a case where the nearest relative gets their say as well, because as it stands, um, a lot of carers out there are complaining about a lot of this confidentiality situation, and this is another thing that can add a layer of confidentiality, which is tragic, especially if the person has good intention, the nearest relative has good intentions. I'm not saying they all do, with the points I've raised before, but it will be sad if they have that double blow. So I do hope that they can be heard. There are situations, yep, with a mental health act, the patient has the choice. And what I want, obviously, is if they have the choice, then someone should still be involved in that care plan, being a nominated person. But I'll always say that's not an easy role to do. It really isn't. It's not something um, people rush to do because the resources are not often there, and that's what I think is the big elephant in the room, really. And anyway, thanks for watching. And if you liked the video, give me a like. I'm happy for those to sort of disagree with me as long as they're not rude about it. That's been the situation in the past. They don't say what they disagree with, but they're happy to call names and all sorts of stuff. And I think that's not good for mental well-being either way. Um, it's good to raise these things. It makes people aware, whether they disagree or not. But going on, yep, if you like the video, give it a like. Do subscribe. I'll try and raise that care awareness as much as I can. Thank you for listening.